The valley was silent in the way only forgotten places can be, dust hanging in the air like a held breath, the kind of silence that makes you check your six even when you know nothing's there. The convoy rolled through at dawn, 11 black SUVs moving in formation through the mountains of northern Albania, engines growling low against the stone. Inside the lead vehicle, Dmitry Volkov leaned back against leather still warm from yesterday's sun, watching the ridgeline with eyes that had seen 3 decades of deals go right and men go wrong. He owned these mountains the way some men own buildings. He'd paid for that ownership in blood and wire transfers, in judges who looked the other way and politicians who smiled at cameras while their accounts grew fat. The sky above was his ceiling, painted in shades of rose and gold, and he'd never seen it fall. But someone was watching. 30,000 feet above, an RC-135 rivet joint aircraft carved lazy circles through the thermocline, its belly packed with sensors that could hear a whisper from 6 miles up. The mission commander, a captain from Offutt who'd been doing this for 9 years, stared at the screen showing 11 heat signatures moving through terrain that was supposed to be empty. The intercepts had been lighting up for weeks, coded traffic, fuel shipments, weapons moving through channels that didn't officially exist. And then yesterday, a single name in a phone call that made Langley wake up and Brussels start making calls to Aviano. Volkov wasn't just another smuggler. He was infrastructure. He was the reason certain missiles ended up in certain hands, why certain chemicals crossed certain borders. The kind of problem that needed solving before it became a crisis. The call went up the chain fast. By the time the sun cleared the peaks, someone in Stuttgart had already made the decision. This wasn't about arrest warrants or extradition hearings. This was about sending a message written in smoke and twisted metal. At Aviano Air Base in northern Italy, the alert sounded at 0547. In the ready room, pilots grabbed flight suits and ran through the mental checklist they could do in their sleep. Most of them had flown over Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, places where the rules of engagement were thick as phone books, and every trigger pull got reviewed by lawyers. But this morning was different. This morning, the authorization came with 2 words that changed everything: direct action. Someone had decided that Dmitry Volkov's convoy would not reach its destination. Someone had decided that the skis weren't his after all. They belonged to a pilot most of the squadron barely knew, a transfer from Nellie's who kept to herself and flew like she had something to prove. Her call sign was painted on her helmet in letters small enough you had to squint. Revenant. It meant ghost. It meant something that returns. And before this day ended, it would mean something else entirely. The mountains didn't know yet. The convoy didn't know. Volkov sat in his leather seat, checking his watch, thinking about lunch in Pristina and the meeting that would make him richer than he already was. He glanced up at the sky through tinted windows, at the perfect blue spreading overhead like a promise. He'd been told once, years ago, by an old Soviet colonel who'd flown Heinz in Afghanistan, that you never hear the thing that kills you. The colonel had laughed when he said it like it was a joke. Volkov thought about that now, about the silence outside, about how beautiful the mountains looked in morning light. He thought about control, about ownership, about how he'd built an empire by understanding that everything, every person, every border, every inch of sky could be bought. But he was wrong about the sky. Major Kira Volatova had been airborne for 17 minutes when the target package came through on the secure channel. She was 34 years old and had more stick time in the A-10C Thunderbolt II than pilots 10 years her senior. The Warthog wasn't graceful. It looked like something designed by someone who hated aerodynamics and loved titanium. The nose was blunt. The wings were straight and stubby. The engine sat high on the fuselage like afterthoughts. Underneath, the GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon hung like the purpose of the entire aircraft. 7 barrels that could spit depleted uranium rounds at a rate that sounded like God clearing his throat. Kira loved it the way some people love ugly dogs. She'd flown F-16s once back when she was trying to prove she belonged, back when every flight was a test, and every landing got critiqued by men who wanted her to fail. The Viper was fast and pretty and responsive. The Hog was slow and ugly and honest. It did one thing better than any aircraft ever built. It killed things on the ground, and it kept its pilot alive while doing it. The coordinates appeared on her display. She checked the map overlay, the elevation data, the air corridors. The target was 40 miles northeast, moving at 35 kilometers per hour through a valley that was essentially a shooting gallery. She toggled her radio. Sabre 2-1, Revenant, I have the package, proceeding to IP. The reply came from her wingman, a captain named Mitchell who'd been friendly enough in briefings but still called her ma'am in a way that felt like distance. Copy, Revenant, I'm 2 miles in trail. Weather's clear, visibility unlimited. It's a good day for it. His tone was light, almost casual, the way pilots talk when they're about to do something that would make civilians sick. Kira didn't respond. She adjusted her grip on the stick, felt the Hog respond with its characteristic stability. Below, the Adriatic was giving way to the coastline, then the first ridges of the accursed mountains. The terrain was gorgeous, all stone and green valleys and villages that looked medieval from altitude. She'd studied the map during the brief, memorized the approach, the egress routes, the emergency landing fields. But maps didn't show you what it felt like to fly into mountains at 300 knots with a full combat load and orders that ended in fire. She thought about the briefing. The intelligence officer, a woman from DIA with cold eyes and colder voice, had laid it out in clinical terms. Volkov was a facilitator. He moved weapons to people who used them on schools and hospitals. He trafficked women and chemicals and technology that ended up in dirty bombs and car bombs and IEDs that turned teenagers into pink mist. The convoy below wasn't just transportation. It was a node in a network that had to be severed. Kira had listened without expression. She'd heard versions of this speech before, in different rooms, about different targets. Sometimes they were true. Sometimes they were true enough. She'd stopped asking which was which around the same time she'd stopped expecting the Air Force to be anything other than what it was. A tool wielded by people who made decisions in carpeted offices thousands of miles from the blast radius. But that didn't mean she didn't care. It meant she'd learned to carry it differently. The valley appeared ahead, a crack in the mountains that ran northwest to southeast. She dropped altitude, descending to 8,000 feet, then 6. The Hog's engines changed pitch, the whole aircraft settling into its attack profile like a predator lowering into a crouch. Her radar warning receiver was quiet. No SAMs, no anti-air, nothing but empty sky and rock. The convoy was visible now on her targeting pod, 11 vehicles moving in formation, oblivious. She switched to the GAU-8, felt the familiar weight of the cannon's presence in front of her, 30 feet of titanium bathtub wrapped around her seat. The Hog was built backward, pilot protection first, weapons second, flight characteristics a distant third. She armed the gun. The tone sounded in her helmet, a gentle confirmation that she could now deliver violence at 70 rounds per second. Her finger rested on the trigger, relaxed. Not yet. She checked her speed, her angle, her altitude. Everything had to be perfect. One pass, multiple targets, no room for error. Mitchell's voice crackled through. Revenant, Sabre 2-1 has visual on the convoy, holding high. Copy, Kira said. Her voice was steady, almost bored. Commencing attack run. She pushed the stick forward and the Hog's nose dropped toward the valley floor. The altimeter unwound, 7,000 feet, 6.5. The convoy grew larger in her display, details resolving. She could see the lead vehicle now, could see the sun glinting off windshields. Somewhere down there, men were talking, laughing, thinking about breakfast. Somewhere down there, Dmitry Volkov was checking his watch. The sky belonged to her now. She squeezed the trigger. The sound was immediate and overwhelming, a roar that vibrated through the airframe and drowned out every other noise. The GAU-8 fired, and for 2 seconds the world was nothing but thunder and brass casings ejecting into the slipstream. The rounds walked up the road in a line of explosions, each impact a small sun blooming and dying. The lead SUV disintegrated. There was no other word for it. One moment it was a vehicle, the next it was fragments spinning through the air in a cloud of flame and shredded metal. Kira pulled up, banking right, climbing back to altitude. Below, the convoy was chaos. Vehicles swerving, men bailing out, some running, some returning fire with small arms that couldn't reach her even if they knew where to aim. "Good hits," Mitchell called. "Lead and tail vehicles destroyed, middles breaking formation." Kira didn't answer. She was already lining up her second pass, eyes on the targeting pod, watching the vehicles scatter like ants. One was trying to reverse, backing into a ditch. Another had stopped completely, doors open, figures running for the tree line. She selected the next target, adjusted her approach. The Hog responded sluggishly. It was never going to win any air shows, but it did exactly what she asked. She dropped altitude again, nose pointing at a cluster of 3 vehicles trying to escape up a side road. The trigger, the roar, the world coming apart in fire. This time she saw bodies, tiny figures caught in the open when the rounds hit. She didn't look away. That was the deal. You don't get to close your eyes. You don't get to pretend it's a video game. You do the thing, you watch it happen, you carry it. She pulled up again, gaining altitude, watching the smoke rise from the valley floor. 8 vehicles destroyed or immobile. 3 still moving, desperate now, no longer in formation. One was racing toward a cluster of buildings at the valley's end. She marked it on her display. "Sabre 2-1 Revenant. I've got the runner heading east. He's yours." "Copy," Mitchell said, and there was something in his voice now, something like respect. "Rolling in." Kira watched from altitude as her wingman descended, watched the trail of smoke as his rockets left the rails, watched the vehicle explode in a fireball that sent a secondary blast 50 feet into the air. Ammunition cooking off, maybe, or fuel tanks rupturing. The other 2 vehicles had stopped. Men were on foot now, running through the trees, throwing away weapons. She made one more pass, low and slow, the Hog's shadow crossing the burning wrecks. No more shooting, just presence. Just a message written in smoke. The engagement lasted 4 minutes. By the time she turned west toward Aviano, the valley was a graveyard of twisted steel and black smoke rising into the perfect blue sky. Inside what remained of the third vehicle, Dmitry Volkov wasn't moving. The impact had thrown him against the door hard enough to crack ribs, and blood ran from a cut above his eye. He could hear screaming outside, could smell gasoline and burning rubber. Through the shattered window he saw the sky, still blue, still perfect, and crossing it, banking in the distance, a gray shape with straight wings and twin engines. He watched it go, this thing that had fallen on him from nowhere, this angel of violence he'd never seen coming. His phone was buzzing, someone calling, someone who didn't know yet that the convoy was gone, that the shipment was gone, that Dmitry Volkov's empire had just been shattered by 60 seconds of cannon fire. He thought about the old colonel again, about never hearing the thing that kills you, but he'd heard it. He'd heard it just fine. The debrief at Aviano was short and professional. Kira sat in a room with gray walls and fluorescent lights while an intelligence officer confirmed kills, marked targets destroyed, assessed collateral damage. 0 civilian casualties. 0 friendly fire. 11 vehicles neutralized. Volkov himself had been pulled from the wreckage by Albanian special forces waiting in the wings, was now in custody and headed for The Hague. The operation was textbook. The kind of mission that would get written up in journals and studied at Nelly's and Eglin. Perfect execution, perfect results. The intelligence officer, a colonel with silver hair and a handshake like a politician, thanked her for her service. Mitchell, her wingman, gave her a nod in the hallway that felt genuine. The squadron commander mentioned drinks later, said she'd earned them. Kira said yes because saying no would have been conspicuous. She went back to her quarters, peeled off her flight suit, stood in the shower until the water ran cold. Her hands didn't shake. They never did. That was something else she'd learned. The body adapts. The mind compartmentalizes. You become functional in ways that would have horrified the younger version of yourself. She thought about the convoy, about the men running through the trees, about the ones who didn't run, who'd been in the vehicles when the rounds hit, who'd ceased to exist in the space between heartbeats. She'd killed before. Afghanistan mostly, supporting ground troops in contact, dropping ordnance on compounds where the enemy was clearly marked by friendlies with lasers and radios. This was different. This was hunting. This was waking up in Italy, drinking coffee, climbing into an aircraft, flying to another country, and erasing people from existence before flying home for dinner. It was clean and clinical and perfectly legal under a dozen international agreements and NATO protocols. It was also murder dressed in authorization codes and rules of engagement. She wasn't sure which bothered her more, that she'd done it, or that it didn't bother her enough. That night at the bar on base, Mitchell bought her a beer and asked her where she'd learned to shoot like that. She told him Nellie's, which was true but not the whole truth. The whole truth was a decade of flying with something to prove, of being the woman in the briefing room, of every mistake being magnified and every success being minimized. The whole truth was learning that perfection was the baseline and anything less was ammunition for the men who thought she didn't belong. So she'd become perfect. She'd flown more hours, studied harder, shot tighter groups, landed in worse weather. She'd made herself undeniable, and then she'd made herself indispensable. And somewhere along the way she'd stopped caring what they thought because she knew, bone deep, blood sure, that she was better. Mitchell didn't need to know that. He was decent enough, young enough to be earnest. He told her about his wife back in Nevada, about the kid on the way, about how he'd signed up after September 11th because it seemed like the right thing, and now he wasn't sure what the right thing was anymore. Kira listened and said the things you say. She finished her beer and excused herself early, claiming exhaustion. She wasn't tired. She just didn't want to be around people. In her quarters, she pulled out the folder she kept in her locker, the one she'd carried through 4 assignments and 3 continents. Inside were photos from another life. Her father in his Air Force blues, captain's bars shining, standing in front of an F-4 Phantom at Udorn Royal Thai Air Force Base. The year was 1972. The war was Vietnam. He'd flown 93 missions over the North, had been shot down once and spent 4 months evading before a rescue helicopter pulled him out of the jungle. He'd come home with medals and nightmares, had raised 2 daughters to be strong and 1 son to be kind. He told Kira when she was 7 years old that the sky was the freest place in the world, that nothing on the ground could touch you up there. He died when she was 15, heart attack in the driveway, sudden and complete. The funeral was full dress, 21 guns, a flag folded into triangles. She joined the Air Force Academy 3 years later. Her mother had asked her why. Kira hadn't known how to explain that she was chasing a ghost, trying to understand what her father had carried, what he'd seen, what had made him wake up screaming sometimes when she was young. She still didn't know. But every time she strapped into an aircraft, every time she pushed the throttle forward and felt the ground fall away, she felt closer to him, closer to understanding. The call sign had come later in training, after her first combat mission in Afghanistan. She'd been flying support for a Marine unit pinned down in the Korangal Valley. The Taliban had them in a kill box, heavy machine gun fire from 3 positions. Kira had come in low, slower than the other pilots would have dared, and methodically destroyed all 3 positions with cannon fire so precise the Marines later said they'd felt the spent casings raining down on their helmets. When she'd landed, one of the older pilots, a major with 3 deployments and a scar on his neck, had looked at her and said, "You fly like you've done this before, like a ghost." The name stuck. Revenant. Something that returns from death. She'd never told anyone that she liked it because it made her think of her father, of the way he'd come back from the jungle, of the way she was trying to come back from whatever was broken inside her. The morning after the convoy strike, she flew a training mission, routine maneuvers over the Adriatic. The weather was perfect again, the sea below like hammered silver. She practiced gun runs on imaginary targets, pulled G's until her vision tunneled, felt the hog respond with its usual blunt honesty. The radio was quiet except for range control calling out altitudes. She thought about Volkov, wondered if he was sitting in a cell somewhere thinking about the sky, about ownership, about how quickly certainty could turn to ash. She thought about the men who'd been in those vehicles. They'd been criminals, facilitators of violence, complicit in systems that destroyed lives. That made it legal, made it justified, made it necessary. But it didn't make them less dead. It didn't make their families less grieving. She'd been on the other side of that equation once, had been the daughter sitting at a funeral trying to understand how someone could be alive in the morning and gone by evening. She knew what that felt like. She landed at Aviano an hour later, taxied to the ramp, shut down the engines. The crew chief, a tech sergeant named Ramirez who maintained her hog like it was his personal responsibility, gave her a thumbs up. She returned it, climbed down, walked across the tarmac in the afternoon heat. Someone in base ops waved. She waved back. Normal day, routine flight, except nothing was routine anymore and she wasn't sure it ever had been. That night she dreamed about her father. He was standing on the ramp at Udorn watching her fly overhead. She could see him perfectly from the cockpit, could see him smiling, could see him pointing at the sky. She tried to wave, but her hands were on the controls, tried to call out, but her radio was dead. He kept pointing, kept smiling, and then he turned and walked away into fog that hadn't been there a moment before. She woke at 0300, heart pounding, the dream still vivid. She didn't go back to sleep. 2 weeks later, the intelligence came through channels marked so secret she needed an escort just to read the brief. Volkov was talking. He was giving up names, routes, contacts, bank accounts. The network was unraveling. The strikes were planned for 4 continents, coordinated actions that would roll up cells from Tirana to Jakarta. The officer briefing her, a 1-star from EUCOM, said they were calling it the most significant counterterrorism operation since Abbottabad. Kira listened and nodded in the right places. She understood that she'd been part of something larger, that her 4 minutes over Albania had been one thread in a tapestry of intelligence and diplomacy and violence that spanned the globe. It didn't make her feel any different. The squadron threw a party when the news broke public. CNN ran footage of arrests in 6 countries, showed warehouses full of seized weapons, interviewed officials who called it a major blow to international crime. At the bar, pilots toasted each other, told war stories, got drunk in the way military people get drunk when they're celebrating not being dead. Mitchell cornered Kira near the pool table, beer in hand, and said she was a goddamn legend. She thanked him and excused herself to the bathroom, where she stood in a stall and tried to remember why any of this mattered. She thought about the old question, if you do a terrible thing for a good reason, what does that make you? The Air Force had an answer, mission accomplished. Her father would have had a different answer, she thought. He'd never talked about Vietnam in terms of victories or defeats. He talked about making it home, about the guys who didn't, about doing your job and living with it and trying not to let it turn you into something you couldn't recognize. She splashed water on her face, looked at herself in the mirror, 34 years old, Major's oak leaves on her shoulders, flight suit still smelling like jet fuel and sweat, eyes that had seen things most people couldn't imagine. She looked tired. She looked hard. She looked like her father did in photos from after the war before he learned to smile again. She went back to the party and stayed until 0100, until people started leaving, until Mitchell passed out on a couch and someone draped a flag over him as a joke. She walked back to her quarters alone, watched the stars wheel overhead, thought about the sky and who owned it and what it cost to claim that ownership. The next morning she flew again. 3 months passed. The operation's effects rippled outward. More arrests, more seizures, more intelligence leading to more operations. Kira flew missions over the Mediterranean, trained with NATO partners, practiced strikes on mock targets in the ranges of southern Italy. The squadron rotated through deployments to Poland, to Romania, to Jordan. She went where ordered, flew what was assigned, executed every mission with the precision that had become her trademark. Her efficiency reports were flawless. Her flight records were exemplary. The squadron commander recommended her for promotion to lieutenant colonel. She was 34 years old and on track to make full bird by 40. Success by any measure. But something had shifted after Albania. The other pilots treated her differently now. Not with hostility exactly, but with a kind of deference she hadn't experienced before. In the ready room when she spoke, people listened. In briefings, her suggestions were taken seriously, implemented without the subtle resistance she'd faced for years. Mitchell started calling her by her call sign instead of ma'am. The younger pilots asked her advice on tactics, on weapons employment, on how to stay sharp. She'd become, without quite realizing when it happened, the pilot everyone wanted on their wing. It should have felt like vindication. Instead, it felt like distance. She kept the folder with her father's photos in her locker, took it out sometimes late at night when the base was quiet. There was one picture in particular she returned to, her father sitting on the wing of his Phantom, helmet off, looking at the camera with an expression she'd never been able to decode. Not quite smiling, not quite grim, just looking like he was seeing something beyond the frame. She'd been young when he died, too young to ask the right questions. Now she had the same expression, she thought. Now she understood why he'd sometimes stare at nothing, why he'd wake up at odd hours, why he'd go for long walks alone. Combat wasn't the stories people told. It wasn't heroism and glory and righteous violence against clear enemies. It was complicated and messy and morally gray. It was making decisions in seconds that you'd spend years unpacking. It was carrying the weight of every trigger pull, every target destroyed, every enemy combatant who was also someone's son, someone's brother, someone who'd made choices that led them to be in the wrong place when you arrived from the sky. Her father had known this. He'd carried it for 30 years after Vietnam. She was starting to understand what that meant. The letter arrived in June, forwarded through official channels from an address in Albania. It was written in careful English, the handwriting precise. Major Volatova, it began, my name is Arbin. You killed my uncle in the valley near Sh Kodair. I write not for revenge but for understanding. He was not a good man. I knew this. Everyone knew this. But he was family and now he is gone and I am trying to understand what that means. The news says he was a criminal. This is true. The news says you were following orders. This is also true. But I wonder if you think about him, if you remember the morning you came from the sky. I wonder if soldiers think about these things or if you learn not to. My uncle said once that the sky belonged to no one, that it was the one free place left. He was wrong about many things. Maybe he was wrong about that too. I do not know why I am writing this except to say I was there. I saw, I will remember, perhaps you will too. The letter was unsigned beyond the first name. There was no return address. Kira read it 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in the folder with her father's photos. She didn't know what to do with it. She didn't know what to feel. Anger, guilt, validation, all of it, none of it, something in between. She thought about responding but didn't know what she'd say. Your uncle facilitated the deaths of hundreds of people, seemed both true and inadequate. I was following orders seemed cowardly. I think about it every day seemed like too much honesty for a stranger, so she said nothing. She put the folder back in her locker and went to the flight line and strapped into her hog and flew, because flying was the one thing that still made sense. The next deployment came in July. 6 weeks in Jordan, flying patrols over Iraq and Syria, ready alert for anything that moved wrong in the desert. The missions were long and hot and mostly boring, hours of circling at altitude waiting for targets that rarely materialized. Kira didn't mind. The boredom was honest. It didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. She flew with different wingmen, trained with coalition forces, dropped practice munitions on old Soviet armor in the ranges south of Amman. The days blurred together in a rhythm of briefings and flights and debriefs and sleep. Near the end of the deployment, they got a real mission. Syrian militias crossing into Iraq, heavy weapons moving toward a refugee camp. The authorization came fast, the intelligence solid. Kira launched with Mitchell on her wing, crossed into Iraqi airspace, found the convoy moving across open desert. This time there was no surprise, no massacre from above. The militia knew they were coming, dispersed, tried to use civilian vehicles as cover. Kira orbited high, watching, waiting. Mitchell wanted to engage, his voice tight with frustration over the radio. She told him to hold, to wait, to let the targets separate from the civilians. They waited 40 minutes. When the shot was clean, she took it, One vehicle destroyed, the others scattering, ground forces moving in to mop up. Textbook. Controlled, precise. She felt nothing, which was its own kind of feeling. Back at the base, Mitchell bought her a Coke from the vending machine and said she'd made the right call, that he'd been too eager, that he was glad she'd been flight lead. She told him he'd done fine, that patience was hard but necessary. He nodded, looked young suddenly, and said he hoped he'd be as good as her someday. She didn't tell him that being good at killing wasn't necessarily something to aspire to. She just thanked him and went back to her quarters and added another mission to the logbook she kept, the one with dates and targets and outcomes written in her careful handwriting. 117 combat missions, 32 confirmed kills, vehicle or personnel, 0 civilian casualties on her watch, 0 friendly fire incidents, 0 losses. The numbers were clean. They told a story of competence, of excellence, of a pilot who did her job better than most. They didn't tell the other story, the one about the cost, about what you had to become to keep those numbers clean. Her father's logbook was in the folder too. She'd found it in a box of his things years after he died, her mother saving it without knowing what it meant. 93 missions over North Vietnam, 47 targets destroyed, 2 aircraft shot down, 1 dead wingman, 432 enemy soldiers killed or wounded. The handwriting was like hers, precise and controlled. The last entry was dated 3 days before he came home. It said only, "Hope this was worth something." She understood now what he'd meant. She understood the question he'd been asking himself, the one he'd carried until a heart attack had answered it for him. The deployment ended. She flew back to Aviano, back to Italy, back to a base that felt less like home every time she returned. The squadron had new pilots, fresh from training, eager and dangerous in the way young people are when they think they understand war. She watched them in the ready room, laughing and joking, playing cards and talking about girls and trucks and the video games they'd play when they got home. She'd been like that once, she thought, before Afghanistan. Before she'd learned that killing was easy and living with it was hard. The squadron commander called her into his office on her second day back. He was a colonel named Hayes, a former Viper pilot who transitioned to Hogs late in his career and still missed the speed. He offered her coffee, which she accepted, and a seat, which she took. He looked at her personnel file on his desk, at the stack of commendations and efficiency reports, and said she was being considered for a position at weapons school. Instructor, training the next generation. She'd be good at it, he said. She had the experience, the skill, the temperament. She asked if that was an order or an offer. He said offer for now. He said she'd earned the right to choose her path, that the Air Force needed pilots like her in the cockpit but also needed them passing on what they knew. He said she didn't have to decide immediately, that she could think about it. She thanked him and left, coffee in hand, and walked across the base in the afternoon sun trying to figure out what she wanted. Did she want to keep flying? Yes. Did she want to keep killing? That was a different question. That night she sat in her quarters and wrote a letter. Not to Arbin, she still didn't know what to say to him, but to her father, who'd been dead 19 years and couldn't read it but who she needed to talk to anyway. She wrote about Albania, about the convoy, about the men she'd killed and the letter from the nephew. She wrote about the weight of it, about how carrying it was different than she'd expected, heavier in some ways and lighter in others. She wrote about the question in his logbook, about whether any of this was worth something. She didn't have an answer. She didn't know if there was one. She folded the letter, put it in the folder with the photos, and decided. She'd take the instructor position. She'd go to Nellie's, teach the young pilots not just how to fly but what it meant, what it cost. She'd try to prepare them for the questions that came after, the ones no briefing ever covered. Maybe that was worth something. Maybe that was a way to honor her father's question without having to answer it. Maybe that was enough. She called the squadron commander the next morning and told him yes. He seemed pleased, said she was making the right choice, that the Air Force was lucky to have her. She didn't feel lucky. She felt tired, but tired was okay. Tired meant you'd been carrying weight. Tired meant you hadn't looked away. 2 weeks later, she flew her last combat mission from Aviano. It was routine patrol, nothing eventful, just her and the sky and the hog responding to her hands like it always had. She climbed to altitude, watched the sun set over the Adriatic, thought about all the missions that had come before. The radio was quiet. The world below was peaceful. For a few minutes up there in the blue, she felt what her father must have felt sometimes, that freedom he'd talked about, that sense of being untouchable above it all. It didn't last. It never did. But it was there, brief and real, and she held on to it as long as she could. She landed at Aviano for the last time as a combat pilot. The crew chief met her on the ramp, asked how the jet performed. She told him perfectly, like always. He smiled, said he'd miss maintaining her bird. She thanked him, shook his hand, walked away from the hog that had kept her alive through 4 deployments and more missions than she could count. She didn't look back. Looking back wasn't helpful. The change of station orders came through in August. She'd report to Nellie's in September, start teaching in October. The squadron threw her a going-away party, speeches and awards, and a plaque with her call sign engraved above a silhouette of an A-10. Mitchell got drunk and cried a little, said she'd saved his life a dozen times just by being good at her job. She told him to stay safe, to trust his training, to come home to his kid. He promised he would. On her last night at Aviano, she walked the flight line alone. The hogs sat in their revetments, ugly and beautiful in the moonlight, ready for whatever came next. She thought about Volkov, about his belief that he owned the sky. She thought about Arbin's letter, about memory and responsibility. She thought about her father standing on the ramp at Udorn, pointing at the sky, smiling at something she was only now beginning to understand. The sky didn't belong to anyone. It was borrowed, temporarily, by those willing to climb into machines and push themselves into the blue. It was held, briefly, by pilots who learned to live with what they did up there. And then it was released, given back to the clouds and birds and the silence that had been there before humans ever looked up and wondered what it would be like to fly. She walked back to her quarters, packed the last of her things, placed the folder with her father's photos at the top of her bag where she could reach it easily. In the morning, she'd leave Italy, leave the squadron, leave the part of her life where she'd been revenant. At Nellie's, she'd be something else. Instructor, teacher, whatever that meant. But tonight, for a few more hours, she was still a combat pilot. She'd still flown more missions, killed more targets, and survived more deployments than most pilots would in an entire career. She'd done it perfectly, precisely, with a skill that had earned respect even from those who doubted her. She'd done it carrying the weight her father had carried, understanding finally what he'd meant about the sky being free. Freedom wasn't absence of responsibility. It was the ability to choose, to act, to carry the consequences without breaking. Her father had been free up there. So had she. And the men in that convoy, they'd learned in their last seconds that freedom belonged to those who earned it, who flew into the mountains at dawn and made the hard choices and lived with them after. Dmitry Volkov had said the skis were his. He'd been wrong. The skis belonged to pilots like Kira Volatova, who understood that ownership was temporary, that control was an illusion, and that the only thing you really possessed was the weight you carried and the choice to keep flying anyway. She turned off the light, lay down on the bed, and closed her eyes. Tomorrow would come soon enough. Tonight she let herself rest. The dream didn't come. For the first time in months, she slept through the night without seeing her father, without reliving the convoy, without hearing the roar of the GAU-8 in her sleep. When she woke, the sun was up, the base was alive with morning sounds, and a transport was waiting to take her to the airport. She grabbed her bag, took one last look at the room she'd lived in for 2 years, and walked out into the Italian morning. The flight to Nevada took 14 hours with connections. She slept some, read some, watched the landscape change below from mountains to ocean to desert. By the time they landed at Nellie's, it was evening, the sun setting over the ranges in shades of orange and purple that reminded her of Albania. A lieutenant met her at base ops, helped her with her bags, drove her to temporary quarters in the instructor housing area. The base was huge, sprawling, full of aircraft from every conflict of the last 50 years. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of jets taking off, that particular thunder that had been the soundtrack of her adult life. She unpacked slowly, hung her uniforms, placed her father's folder on the desk by the window. Outside, the desert stretched away forever, empty and clean. She thought about the instructor job, about the pilots she'd teach, about what she'd tell them when they asked how to be good at this. She'd tell them the truth, that being good meant being precise, being disciplined, being willing to do the hard thing without hesitation. And then, if they asked the right questions, if they seemed like they could handle it, she'd tell them the rest. About the weight, about the cost, about how you carried it and kept flying anyway. But mostly, she thought, she'd teach them to respect the sky, to understand that it wasn't theirs, that it was borrowed, that every time you climbed into an aircraft you were accepting a responsibility that didn't end when you landed. She'd teach them that competence wasn't enough, that you had to be more than good at killing. You had to be wise about it, careful, human. Her father would have approved, she thought. He'd spent his life trying to pass on lessons he'd learned the hard way. Now it was her turn. The cycle continued. The next generation would climb into cockpits and face their own convoys, their own questions, their own letters from strangers asking if they remembered. And maybe, if she did this right, they'd be better prepared. Maybe they'd carry the weight a little easier. Maybe that was worth something. She stood at the window, watching the sun disappear behind the mountains, watching the sky turn from orange to purple to black. Somewhere in Albania, Arben was going about his life, remembering his uncle, wondering about the pilot who'd killed him. Somewhere in Italy, Mitchell was flying patrols, trying to be as good as the instructor who'd taught him patience. Somewhere over the Atlantic, another pilot was ferrying another hog to another base for another deployment. The war machine kept turning. It always did. But tonight, just for a moment, Kira allowed herself to believe that her part in it, the missions, the kills, the weight, had meant something. That her father's question had an answer, even if she didn't quite know what it was yet. That the sky, temporary and borrowed as it was, had been held by someone who understood the cost of holding it. She turned from the window, pulled out her laptop, began drafting her first lecture for the instructor course. Lesson 1, she typed. The sky doesn't belong to you. She paused, thought about Volkov, about her father, about all the pilots who'd come before and would come after. Then she kept typing, words flowing now, years of experience distilling into lessons she hoped would matter. Outside, the night settled over Nelly's. The desert cooled. The jets stopped flying. And in a small room in the instructor housing area, a pilot who'd been called Revenant began the work of teaching others what it meant to return from the dead and keep living anyway. The Mafia boss had said the skis were his. He'd been wrong. The skis belonged to no one and everyone, to the pilots who flew through them and the people who remembered them after. They belonged to the weight carried and the lessons learned and the quiet moments when you understood, finally, that freedom and responsibility were the same thing. Kira typed through the night, building the foundation of what she'd teach. When the sun rose over the Nevada desert, she was still writing, still trying to find the words that would help the next generation understand. She didn't know if she'd succeed, but she knew she'd try. That was all her father had ever done. That was all anyone could do. The story didn't end. It never did. It just changed, evolved, became something else. And somewhere in Italy, a gray A-10 sat on a ramp, waiting for its next pilot, ready to carry them into the sky and bring them home again. The cycle continued. The lessons passed forward. And in the space between missions, in the quiet moments before dawn, pilots like Kira Volatova kept trying to understand what it all meant, kept trying to carry the weight with grace, kept trying to make sure that when they answered the question, was it worth something, they could say yes and mean it.